Good morning, bonjour. Welcome to the final day of the MC2CM Days, an event organized by the Mediterranean City-to-City Migration Project, also known as MC2CM. This project is funded by the EU and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and this event happens under the co-patronage of the Committee of the Regions. The project, MC2CM, is implemented by ICMPD, UCLG, and UN Habitat. We are broadcasting live from Brussels, but you can watch these on our Facebook page, on our LinkedIn page, and if you want to watch this in your preferred language, you can go on a dedicated Clevercast website where interpretation will be available. Over the past few days, we have discussed a number of topics related to urban migration in the Euro-Mediterranean region, and we have tried to facilitate engagement both from the online and also from people that are present here at the Blue Point Brussels to collect questions and comments about these very specific topics. I invite you to do the same today. You can stay tuned using the hashtag MC2CM Days, and you can submit your comments and questions on all our platforms. Today's session will be about gender, migration, and sustainable inclusion in cities. And without further ado, let me ask the direction to launch the video that kicks off the final day of the MC2CM Days. Thank you so much, and I hope you'll enjoy today's session.
Migrant women and girls often experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and find themselves in situations exposed to vulnerabilities. They may face greater risk of discrimination because laws and policies often reproduce or reinforce existing gender equalities in countries of origin, transit, or destination.
Women who is coming from developing countries, women who are never been asked what they want to do due to their cultural barriers or due to their religious barrier or something, but you are offering them. You are again putting them in their traditional role. You are expecting them to be at home, just give a birth to children, and there's lack of resources.
Premier défi qu'on constate, c'est le défi majeur. Personnellement, moi, je le considère comme un défi majeur, c'est la régularisation de la situation des femmes travailleuses. Car ce problème empêche et inhibe l'intégration, que ce soit sociale et économique de ces migrants, des employés domestiques. Et donc, ils sont contraints d'abus de violence domestique, mis à part aussi, selon Madame Julienne, déjà depuis notre dernière réunion, c'est la violence conjugale.
We protect those that are weakest in our society. It is impossible for our societies to protect anyone. And this pandemic has actually allowed us to see this more clearly. So if there is a migrant, a woman migrant, that is suffering and highly at risk, our full society is at risk.
Why not consider a migration policy checklist to make sure that city and local governments are mainstreaming women and girls wherever necessary, and link that to whatever quality indicators there are for the monitoring and evaluation framework.
It is critical that national and local migration policies, law and measures recognize and address the specific needs, challenges and situations of all women and girls, and in migration, especially those at more risk of being exposed to vulnerability.
Bonjour à tous et bienvenue, je m'appelle Alicia Favaretto, je suis chargée de projet au sein de l'ICMPD et j'assurerai la modération de la séance aujourd'hui. Une séance consacrée au genre, à la migration et à l'inclusion dans les villes et principalement à ses défis et ses opportunités. Je suis ravie de vous accueillir pour sur cette thématique. Pour commencer, peut-être, rappelons qu'en 2019, la moitié des 272 millions de migrants estimés vivant et travaillant en dehors de leur pays d'origine étaient des femmes et qu'un grand nombre d'obstacles font face toutes les migrantes pendant leur voyage et leur migration journey, font face à de nombreux obstacles. Ils sont malheureusement assez peu traités et je suis ravie de pouvoir en discuter avec vous aujourd'hui. Afin d'introduire le débat, nous allons tout de suite passer à un discours d'ouverture. Je suis ravie d'accueillir Madame Antier-Grotte, rapporteure. Sorry, Mrs. Antier-Grotte, I hope you can hear us. She's a rapporteur on the new Pact on Migration and Asylum from the European Committee of the Region. Ms. Grotter, we are delighted to have you today. I hope you can hear us well, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers for having me and for giving me the opportunity to speak within this Mediterranean city-to-city migration days. So thank you very much. The European Committee of the Regions entrusted to one rapporteur, myself, the elaboration of its opinion on the new Pact on Migration and Asylum in its entirety and on the action plan for integration and inclusion as well. The committee supports a comprehensive system for managing migration in the long term, based on EU and international law and on European values, in particular the values of solidarity and dignity. Today, there are about 23 million legal migrants in the EU who contribute greatly to our societies. This became even more visible during the pandemic time. However, it is irregular migration where the human tragedy unfolds. Migrants are exploited by smugglers in pursuit of profit, and the price of an illegal journey ticket is the highest a human being can pay. 1,417 deaths of migrants were recorded in the Mediterranean in 2020. Which means on average of 4 human lives lost every day. These are the official figures, but the real number of deaths is unfortunately likely to be much higher. Irregular migration also creates significant pressure on the regions and cities located at the EU external borders. Local populations feel overwhelmed and struggle to provide essential public services. That is why we are calling for an effective solidarity with these regions to alleviate pressure on individual member states and regions, especially to those on the EU borders, which will continue to bear the brunt of the point of first entry criterion. We also want better protection for the vulnerable, less time spent at reception centers on the EU borders, and full respect of migrants' fundamental rights. Our key concern is that the local and regional dimension has not been sufficiently taken into account in the Pact, although this is critical for successful crisis management. The gender dimension of migration and inclusion is addressed in several opinions of the European Committee of the Regions, including mine, and under different angles. Let me start with migration, where there is serious concern for women and girls. The United Nations confirm that almost half of all migrants are women and girls, and women are increasingly migrating alone or as heads of their households. We know that female migrants face major risks, including sexual exploitation, trafficking, and violence. In fact, women and girls account for over 70% of all human trafficking victims, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Women and girls also face additional vulnerabilities when they are displaced by conflict or natural disaster. The chaos caused by such situations and the breakdown of protection systems mean that perpetrators can enjoy impunity. Lack of shelter or overcrowding camps increase the risk of gender-based violence, including sexual violence. Of course, when abuses occur, they are rarely addressed simply because migrant women and girls are too afraid and lack the resources, support, and knowledge to get help. Women and girl migrants are also more likely to face health problems, both in transit and their destinations, because they face higher risks of HIV infection, trauma, and violence. At the same time, they may face barriers to healthcare, especially with sexual and reproductive health services. Bearing in mind these challenges facing women, in my opinion on the Migration Pact, I urge that the financial incentive for relocations should apply not only to unaccompanied minors, but to all children as well as women traveling alone. Another key request of the European Committee of the Regions opinion is about immediate protection. In crisis situations, we propose that member states should have the discretion to grant immediate protection not only to refugees from areas of armed conflict, but also to other vulnerable groups, including women traveling alone. We also call for the screening procedure to effectively identify particular vulnerabilities for those groups that are the most likely to be subject to abuse throughout the migration process, such as unaccompanied minors and women traveling alone. We strongly believe that where special protection needs have been identified, such as pregnant women or victims of gender-based or sexual violence, support should be provided by specialist advisory services or by the authorities responsible for the protection of people in such situations in order to ensure timely expert assistance. It goes without saying that I consider the coordination with local and regional authorities crucial, together with multi-agency work, which is essential when it comes to the detection, identification, and initial assistance to victims. The rule of law and human rights, including the right to healthcare, should apply also at the external borders of Europe, and of course in relation to border procedures. With this in mind, the committee underlines the need to further resources to border regions to ensure that procedures are carried out appropriately, special needs are properly identified, and discriminatory practices such as racial profiling are prevented. But one thing is certain, migration without integration is a project doomed to fail. And integration must happen not only on paper, but also in practice and on the ground. Many local and regional authorities across the EU are willing to welcome on a voluntary basis refugees and migrants beyond their assigned quotas. The European Committee of the Regions has launched the Cities and Regions for Integration initiative to allow for the exchange of best practices. It has also concluded a partnership on integration with the European Commission in order to support EU cities, regions, and rural areas. At the same time, many towns and cities across Europe, including mine, Bremen, have joined initiatives such as the Cities of Safe Haven Alliance or the initiative From the Sea to the City. These are all local efforts and they are often supported by community sponsorship schemes. Many cities are striving to make integration gender sensitive. Eurocities, for instance, has published an inspiring collection of best practices from across Europe. However, we still lack a comprehensive gender-specific approach to integration. But migrant and especially refugee women deserve special attention, since nearly every second migrant and every third asylum seeker is female. Since integration goes hand in hand with the entry into the labor market, these women face challenges when it comes to employment for a number of reasons. They have gaps in education and documented work experience. They lack language skills and information about what is on offer in the host country. They are often subject to gender norms which define what is appropriate for each gender to do. This has implications for the labor market behavior of men and women and deepens the gender gap in labor market participation. Another potential challenge, especially for refugee women, is coping with experiences of trauma and physical abuse before and during refugee flight. And we must not ignore the elephant in the room. Women migrants face double discrimination, as women and as migrants. But there are ways to address these challenges. To give you an example, my city, Bremen, we offer language courses under a program, Mama Learns German, to immigrant women in schools and daycare centers, so that children are cared for in the room next door while mothers take classes. The vast majority of refugee women in Germany wish to take up employment, but many of them have families and small children and cannot enter the labor market without adequate childcare and educational support. So courses combined with childcare are a building block to better support these women. That is also why the European Committee of the Regions advocated for an intersectional perspective with special reference to vulnerable groups such as migrant women when responding to the European Commission's gender equality strategy. We also stressed the need to mainstream intersectionality to all community public policies and to include gender indicators referring also to the migration status. The issue of migrant women's employment was also addressed in one of the European Committee of the Region's own initiative opinions about care and care workers. Indeed, we stress the need to address precarious working conditions of live-in care workers in the EU, who are mostly women and often migrants from third countries. Those women should have access to integration services in their mother tongue and to information about their rights and accessible service as immigrant workers. We also emphasize that live-in care workers should be treated in a similar way to other care workers, and we call for the rigorous application of the Victims' Rights Directive to provide effective support for live-in care workers who are victims of exploitation, regardless of their migration status. Ladies and gentlemen, integration in a modern society cannot succeed without the interplay of democracy, rule of law, openness to the world, and tolerance. And it will fail without genuine gender equality. After all, effective integration and inclusion in the EU of all migrants, men and women alike, is a social and economic investment which makes European societies more cohesive, resilient, and prosperous. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our exchanges.
Thank you so much for this broad overview of all challenges faced by migrant women during their journey. As you mentioned, also the importance of solidarity between the EU countries, member states, as well as southern partners at external border. You did mention many themes that should be addressed, such as migrant vulnerability, violence faced, health issues. To continue tackle these challenges, maybe a bit go deeper on this topic. According to you, how could we maybe go a bit further to ensure the valorization as well of migrant women contribution in maybe host societies?
Well, we have to make sure that we have a special approach to these women, that we get in contact very early, that we can address their needs, and that we can make sure that we have a special like some sort of special programs which also include the care work they already do within their families. If you do something without taking that into consideration, nothing will work, because those women will, of course, not take part in any program or in any political discussion or just talking about their own interests without their family being taken care of.
Thank you very much. Maybe a follow-up question on this. Do you believe that cities could play a key role and be at the core of such a process in valorizing skills, especially care, for example?
Yes, of course, it is always the cities who have to make sure, and that is what we also stress, in my opinion, that we have to make sure on a local basis that things are done. You cannot do that on a national or a regional basis. You have to develop special programs, and that is why we, within the European Committee of the Regions, always make sure that best practices are shown, and we also talk about things that haven't worked, so that we can try not to make the same mistakes all over Europe again and again and again.
Thank you so much for attending our event and presenting this great overview. It's a great start to our discussion. I think we can now move on to introduce our panel today. So I will now introduce you to our esteemed speakers. We'll be hearing from Tunisia with Imen Wardani, who's the vice-mayor of the city of Sousse. We'll be hearing from Jordan with Leila Youssef, who's the assistant director of the International Projects and Program Unit from Greater Irbid Municipality. We'll also be hearing from Michel Levoix, director of the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. We'll be hearing from Ian O'Dwyer, social inclusion specialist from UN Habitat. And finally, we'll be hearing from Émilie Vidal, who's a gender expert and lately supported one of ICMPD's projects on this team. Nous allons donc commencer ce panel avec Imen Wardani, vice-maire de la ville de Sousse, en Tunisie. Bonjour Imen, j'espère que vous nous recevez bien. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, bonjour. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier, vous remercier pour cette invitation. Donc, je suis également très honorée de participer à ces journées de migration de ville à ville en Méditerranée. Ce projet qui nous a permis d'un côté de renforcer nos capacités, d'avoir des connaissances autour de la migration, mais aussi de se rapprocher de ces migrants et de développer des programmes sur terrain. En fait, aujourd'hui, j'aimerais bien partager avec vous peut-être quelques exemples, quelques bonnes pratiques de la ville de Sousse pour vous montrer le rôle clé que peuvent jouer les collectivités locales dans la gestion de la migration, notamment les femmes migrantes. Mais tout d'abord, j'aimerais bien signaler peut-être une chose, c'est que il est vrai que je suis en charge du dossier de la migration de ville à ville en Méditerranée à Sousse, mais aussi je suis la présidente de la commission de l'égalité de genre. Donc, ce sont deux sujets qui me tiennent à cœur et j'ai vraiment le plaisir de vous en parler ici dans ce panel. En fait, par rapport à la ville de Sousse, donc au-delà de la pandémie, parce qu'on ne va pas revenir sur ce qui a été fait, donc au profit des migrants, réfugiés et demandeurs d'asile, indépendamment de leur donc origine, orientation, etc. Mais au-delà de cette crise, nous avons eu la possibilité donc de recenser ces migrants résidant à Sousse et de souligner le taux croissant des femmes migrantes. Peut-être nous n'avons pas vraiment des statistiques bien bien ficelées, mais on peut dire que nous avons entre 35 et 45% de migrants qui sont des femmes en Tunisie. Durant ce travail pendant la Covid, donc différentes catégories de migrantes ont été identifiées. Donc, lors d'un programme que je l'ai présenté dans diverses occasions, donc c'est un programme d'aide sociale au profit des migrants, des réfugiés et demandeurs d'asile, et qui a été mené par la municipalité de Sousse et son collectif d'associations locales, et donc y compris les migrants eux-mêmes qui ont joué un rôle très très important en tant que médiateurs. Donc, qu'il s'agisse d'étudiantes, de travailleuses, de chercheuses d'emploi, qu'elles soient aussi femmes enceintes et avec enfants à charge, elles se sont retrouvées toutes en situation de vulnérabilité accrue devant l'ampleur de la pandémie et le post-pandémie, accentué par, bien évidemment, les époques là où il y avait le confinement général. Donc, pour moi, en ce qui concerne la situation de la femme migrante et par rapport au rôle de la municipalité de Sousse qu'a joué jusqu'au jour d'aujourd'hui, donc c'était principalement, disons, un rôle de coordination, un rôle de mise en réseau et un rôle d'accompagnement, de soutien des associations de migrants ou bien même des associations locales qui essayent de renforcer l'autonomisation et l'inclusion des femmes migrantes. Donc, c'est pour cette raison, lors de la pandémie exactement, puisque là, ça fait 2 ans qu'on travaille sur le projet MC2CM et avec la Covid, donc nous avons décidé d'opter une approche favorisant et priorisant respectivement les femmes ayant des enfants, les femmes célibataires, enceintes et les femmes ayant perdu leur emploi. Donc, on a commencé donc cette approche ou à appliquer cette approche, c'était au début donc de ce programme de soutien aux migrants. Par la suite, pour être en ligne avec notre vision, qui est une vision au sein de la commune, une vision d'une ville inclusive, attractive et égalitaire, donc, et qui est bien évidemment basée sur les droits humains et l'approche participative. Et donc, ça nous a permis de limiter les répercussions de la pandémie sur les plus vulnérables et notamment les femmes. Donc, aussi, il est important de noter qu'il y avait des associations à Sousse qui travaillent dans, disons, des projets ou bien qui apportent du soutien aux migrants, notamment les femmes migrantes. Et c'est de là que la municipalité de Sousse a joué son rôle de médiateur, de coordinateur. Et donc, Donc c'était un exemple, par exemple, je vous cite l'Union nationale de la femme tunisienne, qui est une association tunisienne des femmes et l'association tunisienne des femmes démocrates. Donc ces associations-là ont joué un rôle très important dans la protection et l'assistance des femmes migrantes, mais aussi en coordination avec la municipalité de Sousse. On a essayé donc de développer des programmes afin d'autonomiser et de renforcer les compétences des femmes migrantes. Parce qu'il est important de souligner que lors de la période de la pandémie, c'est-à-dire en travaillant sur terrain et directement en contact direct avec les migrants, on a décelé beaucoup de potentiel de ces femmes migrantes et on s'est dit pourquoi pas donc s'investir, pourquoi pas développer ces compétences. C'est vrai que la situation actuelle de la Tunisie, la fameuse loi 68, empêche les migrants de travailler, mais pourquoi pas au moins dans un premier temps, renforcer les capacités de ces femmes-là, leur offrir des formations, que ce soit dans les petits métiers, la couture, etc., ou bien même tout ce qui est digitalisation. Et donc, le rôle de la municipalité était de mettre en réseau les différentes parties prenantes, que ce soit les migrantes et que ce soit les associations locales. Et même maintenant, on essaye donc de renouer des partenariats avec des ONG en Tunisie et ailleurs. Donc, grâce à ces projets et initiatives, aussi au réseautage mis en place, des relations ont été tissées avec donc les partenaires locaux et notamment les migrants, et donc notamment bien évidemment donc les femmes migrantes, et qui ont donné naissance à deux associations de femmes migrantes qui sont l'association Dignity of Migrant Women et l'association des femmes leaders. Donc ces deux femmes, ils continuent, ils persévèrent et ils continuent à développer leur stratégie, leur programme en étroite collaboration avec la mairie. Et là, d'un autre côté, malgré l'absence de ressources humaines, de compétences, malgré les difficultés financières qu'on est en train de traverser actuellement à la mairie, mais ceci ne nous empêche pas donc d'accompagner ces associations, de les mettre en réseau avec les différents bailleurs de fonds, avec les autres associations pour développer leur propre projet et apporter le soutien nécessaire. Donc, toutefois, je pense qu'il est toujours nécessaire de développer des politiques locales d'intégration sociale et économique des migrantes, bien évidemment en améliorant les conditions d'accueil qui leur permettraient de s'autonomiser et d'accéder véritablement à leurs droits. Et là, je mets l'accent sur différents points où la municipalité peut jouer pleinement son rôle, bien évidemment, avec l'appui des autres institutions publiques. C'est, par exemple, l'accès à la santé que on a remarqué qu'il y a vraiment un vrai souci avec les migrantes. Et bien évidemment, ici, quand je parle de migrantes, de femmes migrantes, je parle aussi d'enfants de femmes migrantes qui, eux aussi, ils sont impactés par ces difficultés. Et donc, il y a aussi également le problème de l'éducation, parce que nous avons remarqué qu'il y a plusieurs enfants de migrantes qui ne vont pas à l'école, et bien évidemment là le problème, donc les barrières linguistiques, le problème de langue s'impose, et finalement c'est par rapport donc l'accès à leurs droits. Et donc, là, on essaye de travailler main dans la main avec ces deux associations, aussi avec les administrations publiques donc, qui représentent les services déconcentrés, et bien évidemment les organisations de la société civile, afin de développer sur terrain différents programmes qui permettront dans le futur d'intégrer la femme migrante dans tous les aspects, que ce soit l'accès à l'information, et là, à travers donc, une application qui est en train d'être développée avec une association locale qui va fournir toutes les informations nécessaires, juridiques, sociales, etc. Et pour les migrants de façon générale, et bien évidemment, la femme migrante va trouver donc aussi ces informations donc dont elle cherche. Il y a aussi donc des programmes dans tout ce qui est autonomisation de la femme, renforcement de ses capacités, les formations, etc., avec donc des associations locales, notamment l'UNFT. Il y a aussi donc un travail à faire avec, par exemple, l'Office national de la famille et de la famille et la planification, donc qui eux ils ont mis en place un espace à Midjeune. C'est un espace dédié aux migrants et notamment les femmes migrantes sur tout ce qui est donc santé de reproduction, etc. Et donc à Sousse, peut-être la municipalité est le moteur dans tout cela. Donc, elle joue le rôle de coordination en attendant à ce qu'il y aura vraiment des politiques migratoires à l'échelle locale, chose sur laquelle on est en train de travailler. Et bien évidemment, ce qui me mène aussi de mettre l'accent, c'est l'approche genre, c'est que c'est un nouveau sujet en Tunisie. Moi, en tant que aussi présidente de la commission de l'égalité de genre, j'essaye en coordination avec même d'autres mairies afin donc d'instaurer cette approche genre et d'intégrer l'approche genre dans la politique publique locale. Donc, pour vous dire là, la municipalité de Sousse, c'est vrai, peut-être nous n'avons pas mené des projets, disons, structurants, mais elle a joué son rôle de coordination, de mise en réseau et d'assistance à ces migrantes et aux associations des migrantes. Donc là, il faut continuer ce travail parce que nous sommes dans une situation assez particulière, donc aggravée par la Covid. Donc,
Imen, il faut conclure, s'il vous plaît.
Pour faire disons, dégager des ondes positives, c'est que en dépit de tout ça, si on croit vraiment en l'égalité de genre, on croit vraiment en l'approche participative, chose que nous tenons profondément, c'est que on peut réussir à intégrer et protéger la femme migrante sur nos territoires. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Imen. Merci pour cette présentation. Je pense que nous avons bien compris l'idée que la thématique migratoire ne relève pas strictement du niveau des municipalités, et pourtant on voit bien que la municipalité de Sousse a pris cette thématique à bras le corps, en tout cas dans un rôle de coordination avec tous les acteurs au niveau local. Peut-être une petite question, d'après vous, avec la pandémie du coronavirus, pensez-vous que cette coopération s'est exacerbée ou en tout cas a été un peu plus précipitée et renforcée, notamment vis-à-vis des femmes migrantes, en tout cas au sein de la coopération et de la collaboration entre la municipalité et les associations?
Tout à fait, effectivement. Donc moi, je le dis toujours, je vois le bon côté de la pandémie, car en fait, c'est vrai qu'on a commencé à travailler sur la migration depuis 2 ans avec le projet MC2CM, mais lors de la pandémie, nous avons donc des liens de confiance entre la communauté migrante et la municipalité ont été créés. Et donc, ces relations se renforcent de plus en plus jusqu'au jour d'aujourd'hui. Donc, pourquoi? Parce qu'on a vraiment réussi à impliquer ces migrants dans toutes nos démarches. C'est-à-dire dès la conception du projet ou bien du programme jusqu'à son mise en œuvre et bien évidemment dans tous nos événements. Quand je dis dans tous nos événements, c'est-à-dire là on essaie que le migrant joue pleinement son rôle en tant que citoyen. Et du coup, cette relation s'est renforcée également avec les associations locales, parce que effectivement, c'est-à-dire quand on développe des programmes, c'est toujours, on insiste à ce que toujours les organisations de la société civile soient prêtes. Aussi, il faut coordonner avec les sommes en début de processus de décentralisation et du coup, donc, nous avons toujours recours à ces administrations publiques. Mais je pense que le fait de créer ces liens de communication, ces liens de confiance avec toutes ces parties toutes ces parties prenantes, je pense que c'est vraiment une réussite pour la ville de Sousse et ce qui a fait que notre projet de soutien au profit des migrants, réfugiés et demandeurs d'asile était entre guillemets élu le programme pilote le plus pertinent.
Merci beaucoup, Imen. C'était un plaisir de discuter avec vous. Nous allons passer à notre prochain membre du panel. We're now going to Jordan with our next speaker, Leila Youssef, Assistant Director of the International Projects and Programs Unit of Greater Irbid's Municipality. Good morning, Leila, and thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have you. I hope you can hear her well, and the floor is yours.
Oui, je vous entends très bien. Je ne sais pas si vous allez partager ma présentation.
Oui, elle est partagée.
D'accord.
Vous pouvez la voir à l'écran?
Oui, mais elle est petite. C'est-à-dire, mais je vais utiliser mon micro pour pouvoir voir les slides. D'abord, je tiens à vous remercier pour cette intervention et de développer toujours notre vision au niveau de la municipalité de la ville de Irbid sur le sujet d'intégration des migrants à l'échelle urbaine. Vous pouvez passer, s'il vous plaît, le slide. OK. Donc, la municipalité de la ville de Irbid, qui se trouve au nord de la capitale de Amman, à 80 km, et elle est considérée comme la deuxième plus grande ville et elle contient 23 communes. Pouvez-vous passer, s'il vous plaît? Donc, nous sommes presque 1 million d'habitants avec 200 000 réfugiés syriens, avec une superficie de 360 km². Donc, il est très important d'arriver à comprendre que aujourd'hui, au niveau de la municipalité, nous cherchons toujours à développer nos expériences concernant les programmes et les initiatives pour l'intégration des réfugiés syriens dans la structure urbaine de la ville. C'est pour cela la question qui se pose, on se pose et on est en train de l'améliorer, sur quoi elle se base notre bonne pratique d'intégration de réfugiés syriens dans la ville de Irbid. On parlera d'abord du plan stratégique de la ville. Le plan stratégique de la ville, de la municipalité de la ville de Irbid qui s'est développé pour la période 2019-2023 contient en se basant sur les objectifs de développement durable et du nouvel agenda urbain, prend en considération l'aspect social, économique et culturel. Et le plan stratégique, donc, il contient un ensemble de programmes qui permettent, que ce soit aux réfugiés syriens et la communauté locale, d'accès aux projets de services qui sont de projets de services qui garantissent l'accès aux services publics, l'éclairage, la gestion des déchets, les parcs, le transport urbain et les projets de développement d'investissement qui permettent de créer certains partenariats entre le secteur privé et public et qui permettent aussi de créer des occasions de travail pour que ce soit la société locale et les réfugiés syriens. Vous pouvez passer, s'il vous plaît, le deuxième slide. Donc, un point très important que nous avons considéré, vous pouvez remonter dans les slides, s'il vous plaît. Oui. Donc, un point très important que nous avons considéré, très important pour pouvoir créer nos programmes et les initiatives, c'est de comprendre les données, que ce soit la population, la structure sociale, les capacités des réfugiés syriens et élaborer une donnée de base géospatiale en se basant sur le système d'information géographique et essayer de cartographier les défis et les opportunités des réfugiés syriens pour pouvoir pouvoir ainsi prendre la meilleure décision concernant l'intégration des réfugiés syriens par rapport à la structure urbaine. Vous pouvez passer, s'il vous plaît. Donc, ça représente l'une des cartes que nous avons élaborées et la localisation de la population syrienne dans les différentes communes de la municipalité de la ville de Irbid et essayer de comprendre le taux élevé de leur localisation par rapport à une structure urbaine. Vous pouvez passer, s'il vous plaît. Encore, s'il vous plaît. Encore. En général, ce sont des graphes qui présentent, les slides précédentes, des graphes qui présentent la localisation des réfugiés syriens par rapport aux différents quartiers. Il est très important de comprendre, de considérer que l'un des points très importants qu'on s'est appuyé sur pour l'élaboration de nos programmes et initiatives, ce sont les différentes lois et réglementations. Et il faut dire que ces dernières années, comme par exemple la loi des municipalités 2015, la loi des constructions et d'organisation des villes et des villages, et la loi la plus importante, la loi de licence professionnelle à domicile, qui a été adoptée ces dernières années et qui permettent que ce soit les femmes et les hommes, et qui permettent que ce soit la communauté locale et les réfugiés syriens d'exercer certaines activités qui sont autorisées par la loi au niveau de leur domicile. Et c'est une démarche très importante pour pouvoir aider les femmes vulnérables dans une situation difficile à travailler à partir de leur maison. Donc, à base de ces données-là, des programmes qui ont été élaborés, d'abord qui garantissent l'accès aux services et l'engagement des citoyens et l'entreprise à domicile. Le dernier slide, s'il vous plaît. Il est très important de dire qu'à travers notre expérience avec les programmes et les initiatives adoptées, nous avons constaté qu'il y a une échelle très importante, pour pouvoir réussir notre programme. C'est l'échelle du quartier. Donc, on a fait ce passage de la ville au quartier à travers des initiatives et programmes qui contiennent un ensemble d'activités et en collaboration avec différents partenariats de communautés locales, les réfugiés syriens, les organisations non gouvernementales, les associations et des associations. Donc, un programme qui a été développé pour renforcer les capacités et qui permettent de renforcer aussi l'intégration des réfugiés syriens avec la communauté locale, et ceci à une échelle plus petite dans la ville, qui est l'échelle du quartier. Donc, en général, nous considérons trois éléments très importants pour pouvoir réussir nos programmes à être appliqués à une échelle locale, qui est l'existence des lois et des réglementations, l'existence des données et les programmes et les initiatives qui sont adoptés à l'échelle du quartier. Et merci.
Merci beaucoup, Leïla, pour votre intervention. Quelques points clés, il me semble, de mentionner, notamment les partenariats avec les entreprises éventuellement privées, en plus des acteurs locaux que la ville d'Irbid met en œuvre, mais aussi l'idée d'avoir une base de données permettant de répertorier, d'un point de vue géographique, la situation géographique des migrants, et l'idée de regarder au-delà du niveau municipal, au sein des quartiers même, pour adapter les politiques. C'est une initiative très, très intéressante. Dans quelle mesure avez-vous pu mettre en œuvre cette base de données ? Avez-vous utilisé des critères peut-être spécifiques d'un point de vue du genre, ou est-ce quelque chose que vous souhaiteriez développer à l'avenir ?
D'abord, merci. On a commencé notre initiative et on aimerait bien sûr pouvoir la développer encore. Les données géospatiales nous ont permis de pouvoir sélectionner les quartiers dans lesquels on commence à travailler et créer des centres communautaires qui contiennent différentes initiatives, activités, que ce soit à l'échelle environnementale ou sociale ou même culturelle, et créer qui permettent à renforcer les capacités de genre au niveau de la ville pour pouvoir les intégrer dans le marché du travail, pour pouvoir les intégrer dans différentes activités urbaines qui se passent dans la ville et que les femmes puissent arriver à acquérir une expérience qui leur permettre de profiter de la loi et la réglementation, de faciliter le travail à partir de leur domicile et commencer à travailler. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Leïla, d'être venue parmi nous aujourd'hui. Nous allons passer à notre prochain membre du panel. We would like to welcome Michèle Levoix, Director of the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. She will provide us with insights on migrant women perception within the EU policies. Dear Michèle, thank you for joining us today. I hope you can hear us well. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. So I'd like to complement the two previous speakers by providing a perspective from civil society. Our organization works with, our members work directly with undocumented migrants throughout Europe. So I'd like to focus on undocumented migrant women in a couple of different areas. So I think just to start off with, first of all, we see that the first way that undocumented migrant women are discriminated is in the eyes of the authorities, in the eyes of the media, because of their irregular status. And this is often defined in negative, dehumanizing terms. So the use of illegal migrant, illegal work, illegal migration, illegal entry, it's all about illegal. It's not about undocumented or irregular. That's kind of a first way. And we've seen that this is kind of reinforced by an approach that Europe has had for at least 20 years now, which treats irregularity as a matter of personal conduct, of choice, of rule breaking, that it must be deterred, it must be sanctioned. But this, in a sense, does ignore a lot of the structural factors that influence why people migrate and how they become undocumented. And it's interesting that one of the key pieces of research in this area was the Clandestino project from 2008 from DG Research that found that most undocumented people enter the EU regularly and then they become undocumented. And I think we see now with the proposal from the Pact that there is a wrong assumption that people who arrive irregularly can easily be divided amongst people who have a right to stay and everyone else who should be returned. So this wrong assumption actually doesn't recognize that member states already grant many different pathways for regular status, not only for asylum seekers, but also for family reasons, for medical reasons, for humanitarian reasons in national law. And so this kind of binary approach would make it very difficult for undocumented people to actually have access to such statuses. We also see that migration systems can create or reinforce structural dependencies. So many people, as we've heard in the opening from the Committee of the Regions, many women are migrating with their families. Many migrant women who are coming are dependent on their spouse. So that means that they have rights due to that relationship with their spouse. And this creates a power dynamic so that when women might have unsafe, unhealthy relationships, abusive ones, they can become undocumented if they lose that status, the spouse status, for example. There are obviously many women who are seeking economic opportunities, and they might find themselves in sectors which are dominated by women workers, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Just to also mention that the ILO estimated in 2013 that roughly 55% of the 4.1 million domestic workers in Northern, Southern, and Western Europe were migrant workers, and that represented approximately 1.8 million women migrant workers. So I wanted to highlight here just three brief areas concerning undocumented women: access to justice, access to services, and labor migration pathways and regularization. Concerning the first one on access to justice, we see that many women who are undocumented workers, who are on a spouse visa, etc., they might have a permit which is dependent on their relationship. So in the case of the worker, it's on the employer. In the case of the spouse, it's on the spouse. So this means that when they might try to assert their rights if they're abused during that relationship by the employer, by the spouse. They have to seek their rights as victims, and this is where they have difficulties in trying to assert them. We had a case in June this year from the Domestic Workers League of PICA member CSA trade union in Brussels, which was organizing a protest because one of the domestic workers that they worked with had died. Cristiane Fernandes was a 30-year-old undocumented Brazilian woman, and she was the mother of 2 children. She died this year on the 12th of May from cervical cancer because she was raped multiple times by her employer in her workplace. The Domestic League, Workers League of the CSA Brussels were calling on the Belgian government to provide residence and work permits and access to services for victims of abuse. So we need to, throughout Europe, address this ingrained imbalance across the whole continent, that immigration enforcement is currently the top priority, rather than labor rights protection or victims protection. And we don't feel that migrant women should be deported just because they want to seek help or just because they want to exercise their rights as workers or victims. So we recommend that labor and victims' rights should be applied for all workers, regardless of migration status. This means that undocumented workers should be able to file a complaint against their employers. They should be able to access remedy without risking immigration enforcement. It was already mentioned by the Committee of the Regions rapporteur in the opening about the Victims' Rights Directive at the EU level, calling for a better implementation regardless of status. There's also an opportunity now that the strategy on victims' rights has specifically, when it was launched last year, recognized that undocumented migrants are inherently vulnerable because of their irregular status when they're victimized. So we hope that this combination also with the strategy, we'll recognize a lot of good practices, especially that cities are already doing on safe reporting. And we also have the upcoming legislation that Commission President von der Leyen referred to recently in the State of the Union speech. So this upcoming legislation on violence against women. We have a number of recommendations for how that legislation should ensure that undocumented women are also, in a sense, protected by it. By basically, the first one is that the focus of any legislation like that should be on prevention of violence, and it should be on support and recognition for all victims, regardless of migration status. We need to look at holistic services reaching all women, also contemplating residence permits for all survivors of violence, address violence in the workplace, shouldn't further criminalize sex work, should have adequate monitoring and evaluation, allowing individuals who have been affected to give input, and there should be very good awareness raising campaigns. So the second area that I wanted to look at is access to services. We know in terms of access to justice, if a woman who is undocumented tries to file a complaint at the police, tries to go to the hospital if she's been victimized, these are all potentially threatened because she's coming into contact with authorities who may transmit her personal data to the immigration authorities, and that may result in deportation. So this whole cycle, it perpetuates mistreatment, it promotes mistrust, fear of authorities, fear of services, and it limits undocumented women's agency and power. The Center for Reproductive Rights, CRR, did a recent report which found that in 16 EU member states, so roughly 2/3 of the EU, undocumented migrant women as access to affordable maternal health care throughout pregnancy is undermined or it's denied due to the laws and the policies in these 16 member states that directly or indirectly prevent them from accessing free or subsidized care. But we've actually found that there's some good practices in terms of access to services and particularly healthcare for undocumented migrant women at the city level. And there's one that I wanted to share with you from Frankfurt in Germany, which is actually a partnership between an organization called Maisha which started in 2001 to introduce what they call a humanitarian health consultation center in the city of Frankfurt to help undocumented pregnant women, mainly African women when it started, to basically help them get an appointment with a clinic and to process their paperwork. Because of the lack of a firewall in Germany, it's extremely difficult for undocumented women to get access to mainstream health services. So the city of Frankfurt actually responded quite positively to this initiative. Over the year, Maisha's built many partnerships with many different actors. The women's department of the city of Frankfurt has provided funding for the organization's work. The health department has facilitated cooperation with doctors. The social care department has provided medicine. And in 2002, the organization Maisha received the integration award by the city of Frankfurt. Several other city administrations throughout Germany have also implemented drop-in centers that have humanitarian consultation hours. So our recommendation is that there are firewalls, which is basically separating public functions, access to services, access to justice from immigration control, so that undocumented migrant women can safely access them without fearing immigration enforcement. And it's also, I think, important to note that firewalls are detailed as one of the good practices in the report called Migrants with Irregular Status in Europe, Guidance for Municipalities. This is produced by Oxford in the City Initiative, University of Oxford, the City Initiative on Migrants with Irregular Status in Europe. And just as the last point, I wanted to also highlight labor migration pathways and regularization. So I wanted to also just give the example here once more of domestic work, because I think it's one of the areas where you can also see that there's been a lot of work. There's the ILO Convention 189 and the 10th anniversary, and yet still enormous challenges. So just looking at this example of domestic work, given those figures that I mentioned previously, basically, with the available data, we can see that 1 out of 2 domestic workers across Europe are migrants, and women are a huge, huge percentage of those migrants. And yet it's still very difficult for non-EU nationals to access a work permit, to act as domestic workers. And why is this so? Because we see that there's a lack of recognition. There's a lack of value of domestic work as work. There's a bias in migration policy, both the EU and the national level, that predominantly focuses on highly skilled labor migration. And we can see this also in the Pact on migration, where it has very limited focus on labor migration pathways, except for talent partnerships. Within PICUM, we've actually mapped out 17 European countries, and we only found 4, which were Cyprus, Malta, Poland, and Portugal, who had relatively accessible opportunities for non-EU nationals to get a work permit for domestic work. So within this quite restrictive context, it's quite difficult for migrants to have a status which is not dependent on their employer. So many of them work irregularly or undeclared. So we recommend that domestic workers, in particular, but migrant workers in general, should be able to get work permits at the national level that promote autonomy, decent work, and social inclusion under general work permit schemes. And we actually have a whole criteria that we've developed. And on the issue on regularization, I think what we've also found recently is that there's no longer any doubt that regularization is a policy tool that's been used by EU countries over decades, because there's increasing evidence that this is the case. Just last year with the pandemic, Portugal regularized nearly 250,000 undocumented. Italy, it's still ongoing, but we can look at least 220,000 people who have applied. 85% of those who applied were home care workers, 15% in the agricultural sector. Ireland in April this year announced proposals for a regularization scheme for undocumented in Ireland. So we know that EU policies at the national level are being developed on regularization. And why? Because many different reasons. Migrants contribute to the social security system that strengthens social security. There's improved pay, there's improved conditions once they're no longer working as irregular workers. Children are not necessarily separated from their parents when you can have a regular status. So there's many different reasons why, but We also recommend that when they are developed, that the criteria should be clear, regularization should be accessible to undocumented migrants, the status should be stable, independent of the employer, and then the whole program should ideally be developed in conjunction with civil society. So I'd just like to end right here and just say, basically, if there ever was a question that are undocumented women or migrant women inherently vulnerable? No, but irregular migration status or precarious status can really increase their vulnerability to harm. So we'll never really collectively achieve gender equality at the expense of migrant women. So we need to prioritize decent work, policy options on regularization, access to services and justices without fear of enforcement, and especially to center migrant women's voices and needs in our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I'd like to stress a few points that you mentioned, especially regarding the approach to take and maybe the switch of approach that might be worth considering on the illegal versus undocumented, which create different issues and are actually not the same topic at all, but it's rarely mentioned. Also, the binary approach of rights to stay versus no right to stay that might involve different stakes that are not worthy considered, let's say. Maybe a few questions, as you mentioned these vicious circles involving female. For example, you mentioned the case about one being assaulted. I'm assuming once you are being assaulted, the difficulty is first to seek access to justice, but also then to seek access to services. So they have to face like many challenging at the same time. While doing those studies, how challenging was it to meet with those people, to raise maybe awareness on the possibilities they might not know about? What were the key challenges to find out those information?
Thank you for your questions and comments. Our network is actually, we have about 160 members. So our members actually work directly with undocumented migrants. So that actually forms the basis of all of our work and advocacy. So I think they see undocumented women. We actually have a number of organizations that are led by migrant women, so who work directly with other migrant women, and who are, I would say, really excellent examples of promising practices at the local level. Many of them actually also work with cities. I think some of the challenges that organizations face in reaching out and doing their work with undocumented women are the lack of support, the lack of funding. Some organizations are also criminalized because they are working with undocumented migrants. The Rizoma project found that there were nearly 200 people over a several-year period in the EU who had legal cases against them because they were working with providing humanitarian assistance to undocumented migrants at the borders or in other regions. That was definitely an undercount, and it doesn't also refer to all of the people who are harassed in their daily work. These were only legal cases in the court system. So I think there's this general context of organizations who are working with a very vulnerable group who themselves are not supported, who might even be criminalized. But then I think the questions when people, for example, undocumented women try to assert their rights if they've been a victim of gender-based violence or in the workplace or in the domestic sphere, they face all the other barriers at the police, at the healthcare. So that's why it's actually our work as PICUM is never purely about migration policy. The solutions that we find are always in multiple policy areas, in women's rights and healthcare policy and justice, education, etc. So it's a multiple type of approach.
Thank you very much for highlighting this, especially involving and acting at the intersectional level in all those different themes, but also at different level in terms of cities and maybe national level or territorial level. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was a pleasure hearing you. We will now move on to our next panel member. We're delighted to welcome Jan O'Dwyer, who's a social inclusion specialist with UN Habitat. Hi, Jan. Hope you can hear us well. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to ask, can you hear me okay, loud and clear? I would like to thank you all for coming here. I'm very honored to contribute to this conversation. I have a presentation I would like to give, if that can be brought up. Yes, perfect. Can you go 2 slides in, please? Yes. So first, I would like to say today I'm going to speak mostly about migrants in locations of arrival and also migrants from low and middle income countries. It's important to acknowledge this. I myself am a migrant. I'm living in Brussels as well, but there's very different challenges that I will face due to my privilege. Next slide, please. So what would our economies be without migrants? Next slide. In 2019, half of the estimated 272 million migrants living and working outside their countries of origin were women. But as has been mentioned many times, they are particularly overrepresented in often informal or low-skilled occupations, providing vital care and support services in healthcare and social care and domestic work. This often implies unsocial hours, shift work, and low pay. And often, as has been said, this often implies a lack of formal contracts and a lack of social protection, which, as we can see in the context of the coronavirus, becomes increasingly more important. Next slide, please. So migrants, men and women can, thank you. Migrant men and women can face specific challenges in terms of their irregular migration status, which fear of deportation, and a challenge for finding formal employment. This can also make it very hard to find migrants in cities if they do not wish to be found. And this creates challenges for assessing their needs and making specific programming. They also face limited access to basic services, decent housing, and a lack of information on their rights. Next slide, please. UN Habitat, in their work, also has a focus on the spatial exclusion of migrants. Often migrants live in poor or underserviced areas of the city, and it's not just about if they can legally access services, but can they physically access them. This kind of spatial exclusion also contributes to a lack of access to employment opportunities, but also it reduces the opportunities for positive social interactions with host communities, which also can increase the incidences of xenophobia. So what kind of specific vulnerabilities, gender-specific vulnerabilities to integration can women migrants face? Well, women migrants can face a higher risk of social exclusion because of an inequitable balance of family and childcare obligations that can impede their integration into the labour market with fewer opportunities, even for the highly qualified. They often don't benefit as frequently from skills assessment or retraining measures and other integration programs. They've also been found to have greater language challenges and educational gaps. For example, according to the European Network of Migrant Women, a migrant woman on average is nearly 10% less likely to read or write and are more likely to struggle with mental health and to be paid less. But what kind of solutions can we take, or can municipalities take to address these barriers? Next slide, please. So I guess programs must focus on tackling the gender-specific intersectional needs of migrant women. Cities must focus on interventions that tackle access to labour markets, civic participation, integration, female empowerment, and action against gender-based violence. In particular, on the gender-based violence point, the coronavirus has not just been a crisis of health, it's also a crisis of gender. Many European countries have noted the significant uptick in cases of gender-based violence, and migrant women in particular with less access to information and maybe reduced mobility, it's much harder for them to report on this incidence. Also, if migrant women might need more encouragement to engage or re-engage in training or to take up employment, notably when they come from countries where women are underrepresented in the labour market and in which they are culturally not encouraged to join and take up a job. Next slide, please. So also recent global frameworks, such as the Global Compact for Safe, Regular and Orderly Migration, the Global Compact on Refugees, and UN Habitat's New Urban Agenda. These all recommend whole of government, whole of society, people-centered and inclusive approaches. Also for UN Habitat, area-based approaches is very important. So instead of specifically focusing on migrant women or host women from host communities, UN Habitat often picks a very underserviced area and tries to address the needs of both migrant and host community women. And the idea behind area-based approaches is often to reduce the opportunities for social tensions between migrant and host communities, as everybody can perceive that they're benefiting equally from the intervention. But I'd like to look at some maybe innovative or inspiring practices that some cities around the Mediterranean are taking. Next slide, please. In Turin, the local municipality is linking migrant women to services in some innovative ways. Their Women in the Neighbourhood scheme is supporting migrant women to get access to services in a private peer-to-peer relationships with commercial enterprises. And they have a community association initiative, which brings diverse migrant communities together into working groups. And this can help the municipality to identify the needs of migrant women and connect them with different municipalities. The Turin My City program is very innovative, I think. It takes a holistic approach by linking migrant women from the North African region with language teachers, social workers, and doctors. Most importantly, these teachers and trainers are all women themselves, and they're joined by a North African volunteer trained on North African culture. Through these, they can learn mathematics, finances, language skills, and how to navigate society in Italy. I think this point is very interesting because it addresses both the gender accessibility of training, but also the cultural barriers to accessing and understanding this information. Next slide, please. In Malta, the Migrants Women Association is following lines to develop livelihoods and also strengthen the capacities of women during coronavirus. Their Saha Kitchen project envisions the empowerment of migrant women through a catering project in which international, healthy and ethnic dishes are served, building participants' capacity, income generation and confidence, while also integrating them into society and also exposing host communities to the different cultures of some of the nationalities of migrant women. They also have a very interesting COVID-19 project, which is delivering pre-prepared food, coverage of basic supplies, employment guidance, translation, and support during this crisis. As I said, in addition to crisis of gender-based violence, the coronavirus in terms of gender is also a crisis of unpaid care work in the home. Due to their roles in society, migrant women will be expected to care for sick family members, and also there'll be increased domestic and care work in the home due to children being home from schools. So these kind of projects, if they're designed in the right way, can really address these gender-specific needs. Next slide, please. In Barcelona as well, there's some different practices which are quite inspiring. The Servei Solidari Foundation, they're developing a microcredit project which pairs together different potential migrant women entrepreneurs to discuss business plans, expand their network, work with established entrepreneurs, and most importantly, to deposit money to allow for low interest loans for group members. Often migrant women, they have greater barriers to joining larger institutions. So I think initiatives like this, which can encourage them to begin their own initiatives, is really promising. Barcelona has also incorporated a gender contingency plan at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, which saw the incorporation of a gender perspective to all participatory and decision-making parts of the city. And the city also has a support plan for domestic workers and increased the flexibility of work times, which is particularly important for migrant mothers with high domestic and care work burdens at home. Finally, next slide, please. What we can see from some of these practices and more generally is the importance of integrated approaches across local government and at different levels of government, that it's not just one unit, but a multiple approach. It's also important to decentralize power and resources to municipalities in this time of crisis and more generally. Often migration legislation is made at national level, but it is municipalities themselves who are having to implement this, and they're at the front lines to assess needs. Partnerships with local associations, NGOs, and international organizations are very important to both sometimes CSOs and faith-based organizations. They may be better positioned to engage with migrant communities due to maybe a higher level of trust, and also a better position to assess the needs, and also maybe to lobby host communities into accepting the needs of migrant men and women. But also a good practice is to remember to work through and empower migrant women as ambassadors and as collaborators in their own communities. I've seen some interesting initiatives where migrant women from different parts of the city are invited in to be trained in information on the education system, the financial system, the health system. And then when they go back to their communities, they can spread this information in a culturally accessible way. Also very important is to include the private sector and remember to increase solidarity between host and migrant populations. And overall, the focus should be on whole of society, whole of governments, and area-based approaches. I think that is all from me. Thank you very much for listening and for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation and reminding us also about social exclusion, which is faced constantly by migrant women. You also touched on the language barrier, which we did not mention before, but it's also key when it comes to inclusion and better include female migrants. Something really interesting also is the approach to reach out to both female migrants as well as female host communities, because by intervening, I'm assuming you don't want any programs to be detrimental or badly perceived by the host community. Maybe could you tell us more about this approach to combine maybe and have some better social cohesion and solidarity between host communities and migrants?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess when you can bring host communities together with migrant communities and identify the problems within their neighborhood, you're assured to get a more holistic view of things. But even through the process of just bringing them together in working groups or in consultation like that, it can really enhance social cohesion even just through the process. But even not just in terms of women, even bringing men together, it's important to remember that gender is just not about women, it's also about masculinity. Bringing men from host communities and from migrant communities together can maybe develop a different idea of masculinity in a neighborhood, which can address maybe the root issues behind some of the gender inequities that migrant women and also host communities can experience.
Thank you very much for your time and for joining us today. We will now move on to our next and final panelist here with me today. I would like to introduce you to Émilie Vidal, experte en genre. Émilie a contribué à la production d'études et à la coordination de programmes avec la Fondation des femmes de l'Euro-Méditerranéen. Elle est aussi consultante pour l'ONU Femmes. Et pour l'ICMPD, elle a notamment dernièrement coécrit une note de politique sur cette thématique dans le cadre du projet politique et pratique d'une bonne gouvernance migratoire fondée sur les preuves en Afrique du Nord. Émilie, bienvenue. Merci d'être parmi nous et c'est à vous.
Bonjour. Je suis ravie de participer à ce panel aujourd'hui pour vous parler d'une note politique que nous avons très récemment élaborée au sujet des femmes. En fait, l'objectif c'était d'examiner l'entrepreneuriat en tant qu'une possibilité d'inclusion socio-économique pour les femmes migrantes en Afrique du Nord. L'idée c'était de contribuer à produire des connaissances disponibles pour les responsables politiques et à leur fournir quelques éléments pour promouvoir l'inclusion du genre dans les politiques de la migration dans cette région de la rive sud de la Méditerranée. Cette note politique a été réalisée à partir d'une revue de la documentation disponible sur les lois les politiques et les programmes de soutien à l'entrepreneuriat des femmes migrantes. Nous avons également réalisé des entretiens avec plusieurs acteurs, aussi bien du monde académique, de la société civile, mais aussi d'administrations publiques et également de quelques organisations internationales. Et nous nous sommes centrés sur 4 pays, donc l'Égypte, la Libye, la Tunisie et le Maroc. Voilà. Donc, j'ai une présentation. Je ne sais pas si on peut la voir. Voilà, parfait. Donc, vous pouvez passer la deuxième diapositive. Voilà. Donc, au niveau, je vais résumer parce qu'il y a beaucoup de choses dans cette note. Et en plus, beaucoup de choses ont déjà été dites. En tout cas, il y a beaucoup de résonance avec les interventions des intervenants précédents. Donc, au niveau des constats, déjà, il y a un écosystème qui est peu favorable pour l'entrepreneuriat des personnes migrantes en général. Bon, ça a été déjà dit, mais les difficultés d'accès à un statut administratif régulier, la difficulté de travailler ou en tout cas de créer une entreprise dans le pays d'accueil, l'absence souvent de langage explicite qui fait référence aux migrants dans les textes. Il y a bien sûr les barrières culturelles et linguistiques. Il y a aussi l'incertitude, puisque quand les femmes sont dans ces pays, parfois, bien sûr, elles ne savent pas combien de temps elles vont rester, alors que l'entrepreneuriat demande un investissement vraiment de se projeter dans l'avenir. Voilà, donc il y a aussi cette pandémie du coronavirus qui a frappé plus, d'après les données de l'ONU Femmes notamment et d'autres sources, la pandémie a frappé plus les entreprises menées par les femmes que celles menées par les hommes. Alors, le deuxième constat, c'est le manque de données sur les profils en fait de ces femmes migrantes dans ces pays d'Afrique du Nord et dans ces villes aussi d'Afrique du Nord, puisqu'aujourd'hui le focus est sur les gouvernements locaux. On connaît peu donc leurs compétences, leurs aspirations, leur parcours. Et c'est bien dommage. On sait par exemple, il y a des tendances. On sait que les femmes migrent de plus en plus seules, que beaucoup travaillent dans l'informel, donc leurs entreprises ne sont pas formalisées. Et on sait également que beaucoup sont les gagne-pains de leur foyer, mais en fait, il y a encore trop peu d'études ou d'analyses dédiées. Alors, outre l'environnement qui est peu favorable et donc le manque de données, il y a un manque de prise en compte du genre dans les politiques, lois et programmes migratoires concernant l'autonomisation économique et le soutien à l'entrepreneuriat. En fait, lorsqu'on regarde les programmes de soutien, les politiques, souvent, il n'y a pas de reconnaissance que les hommes et les femmes ont des besoins différenciés et font face à des situations différentes. Je vais donner quelques exemples. Donc, les femmes ont en général, malheureusement, à cause des discriminations multiples qui se superposent, les femmes ont moins de capital de départ pour commencer à créer leur affaire. Elles ont peut-être plus de difficultés d'ouvrir un compte bancaire dans certains endroits. Elles ont moins de temps à consacrer à l'entrepreneuriat en raison des charges domestiques et familiales. Une plus grande précarité qui les force à se concentrer sur les besoins primaires. Et aussi, il ne faut pas oublier que les époux ou l'environnement familial peut s'opposer à leur participation à des programmes de formation ou à des programmes de microcrédit. Donc, il faut vraiment tenir compte de tout cela dans les programmes. Et notamment, on peut penser à cette approche ne pas nuire des Nations Unies, donc en faisant en sorte que le fait que les femmes migrantes participent à des programmes d'entrepreneuriat ne les mette pas en difficulté, ne crée pas des violences basées sur le genre, comme cela a été rapporté dans certaines études qu'on a pu trouver. Alors, je vais passer aux recommandations, si vous pouvez passer la diapositive. Voilà. Donc, c'est vraiment les recommandations principales. Donc, d'abord, bien sûr, il faut collecter plus de données, ventilées par sexe, idéalement par âge aussi, mais par sexe, bien sûr, en partenariat, si possible, avec les entités de la recherche. Il nous faut plus de données sur aussi bien la création que l'expansion des entreprises qui sont dirigées par les familles, par les personnes migrantes, donc femmes et hommes. il nous faut aussi plus de collaboration entre les institutions publiques qui collectent ces données pour croiser, puisque par exemple souvent les services qui font les registres sur les personnes migrantes ou réfugiées ou demandeuses d'asile ne communiquent pas du tout avec ceux qui enregistrent les nouvelles entreprises dans le pays ou dans la région. Même si, comme l'a rappelé l'intervenante de PICUM, il faut faire attention que ces données ne soient pas utilisées à l'encontre des personnes migrantes, bien sûr. Donc la deuxième recommandation, c'est de renforcer les capacités des agents des services publics sur les politiques et programmes de soutien à l'entrepreneuriat qui sont inclusifs des personnes migrantes, et ceci notamment dans les grandes villes et les capitales où se concentrent les personnes migrantes. En fait, nous avons constaté lors de notre analyse qu'il existe des lois ou des mesures qui sont en fait, par exemple, on va exempter de taxes à une personne entrepreneuse, et ceci va être aussi bien, cette mesure va être ouverte aux personnes migrantes, mais malheureusement, les services publics peut-être ne sont pas assez sensibilisés et formés. Donc, avec beaucoup de nouvelles lois sur l'auto-entrepreneur, sur les coopératives, qui sont inclusives des personnes migrantes, au Maroc, en Tunisie notamment, il faut vraiment former les agents des services publics pour que par la suite, elles puissent mieux accompagner les personnes migrantes et notamment les femmes. Donc la troisième grande recommandation, ça a déjà été dit, mais il faut encore le souligner, c'est développer des partenariats avec les organisations de personnes migrantes, notamment les organisations de femmes migrantes et les organisations des droits des femmes. Donc c'est très important parce qu'elles sont mieux placées, et justement je crois que ça a été relevé par l'intervenante de la ville de Sousse. Ça permet de créer une confiance envers les institutions publiques que les personnes migrantes n'ont pas. Je vais donner juste un cas que nous avons trouvé intéressant. C'était au Maroc. En fait, dans 2 régions pilotes, les services publics, en fait, ils ont engagé des personnes migrantes en tant qu'agents communautaires pour aller sensibiliser et informer sur des programmes de formation à la gestion d'entreprise qui étaient proposés dans la ville. Et en fait, ça a vraiment très bien marché parce que comme les femmes qui ont été recrutées faisaient déjà partie de réseaux, bien sûr, ça facilite beaucoup l'accès des femmes à l'information et de pouvoir accéder à ces ressources. Et enfin, je voudrais terminer par l'importance de documenter, de valoriser et de diffuser les parcours de réussite des femmes migrantes, entrepreneuses, parce que cela peut vraiment inspirer d'autres femmes migrantes, mais aussi d'autres femmes dans les communautés d'accueil. Et ça, c'est vraiment très important, notamment quand on pense que quand on sait que dans la région du sud de la Méditerranée, il y a encore des taux de participation au marché du travail qui sont très faibles. Donc, en fait, le fait de vraiment encourager cet entrepreneuriat des femmes migrantes et de valoriser et promouvoir les cas de réussite, ça peut aussi permettre de améliorer le statut en fait des femmes, en général, pas seulement les femmes migrantes. Donc je pense que cet aspect en fait, cet aspect d'inclusivité est très important. En fait, quand on va entreprendre ou quand on va mieux connaître les situations des femmes entrepreneuses migrantes, ça va aussi bénéficier aux femmes de toute la société. Voilà, donc si vous voulez passer la dernière diapositive, je vous invite à vous rendre sur le site de l'ICMPD pour retrouver cette note politique, et je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Émilie, pour cette présentation et pour ces recommandations, et de nous avoir présenté cette étude peut-être un peu plus concrète sur le cas de l'entrepreneuriat et de l'inclusion. Je me tourne maintenant vers Marco. Est-ce que nous avons des questions peut-être pour nos membres du panel ?
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Emily, for your very good intervention. It's been quite a week, a lot of interventions, a lot of discussions about a number of issues related to urban migration governance. And this hybrid format has also allowed us to bridge the online with the in-presence new dimension that we're getting used to. And we have received one question which I would like to ask to one of our city representatives, namely Leila Youssef. Madame Youssef, est-ce que vous nous entendez? On a reçu une question que je voudrais vous poser. Ça vient d'une étudiante de l'université Pompeu Fabra, directement de Barcelone, et la question est la suivante. Considérez-vous que la dimension de genre a pénétré le domaine local pour la première fois pendant la pandémie? Est-ce que vous pensez que la pandémie, en fait, a généré ce nouveau débat, un débat qui peut-être n'était pas présent au niveau local avant la pandémie? Quelles sont vos pensées sur ce sujet?
Oui, en effet, avec la pandémie, il était question de revoir comment pouvoir mettre en pratique la question de genre dans la ville et sur le plan au niveau de la municipalité aussi. C'est pour cela il était question autant aussi au niveau de la municipalité, on travaille à travers des lois et des réglementations. La loi, il est question que adopter des lois et des mesures qui permettent plus aux gens au niveau de la ville de Irbid, que ce soit la communauté locale ou les Syriens ou les réfugiés syriens, d'intégrer par exemple le secteur de travail, mais de pouvoir travailler à travers leur domicile dans certaines activités. Donc la loi qui a été adoptée au niveau des municipalités, qui favorise le travail et donner des autorisations ou que ce soit les familles hommes ou femmes de travailler, exercer certains métiers, était un support très important dans la pandémie, de pouvoir exercer et élaborer une structure de travail à domicile. Merci.
No, merci à vous. I will thank all our panelists today, and of course our great moderator. Thank you, Alicia Favaretto, project officer from the MGAP project implemented by ICMPD, Iman Wardani, Leila Youssef, Michelle Levoy, Ian Dwyer, and Emily Vidal. And of course, I also take the opportunity to thank again Antje Grother from the Committee of the Regions and the Committee of the Regions for all their support throughout these 5 days. And it's time now for some closing remarks. As I said earlier, the MC2CM project wants to bridge the gap between different parts of the Euro-Mediterranean region. They want to discuss issues that are very important at the local level, but it's not just about giving light to the local level, it's about creating cooperation between different levels of governance. And this is why I think there isn't a better person to give us closing remarks for this full week of debates, of discussions, of presentations, of concerns raised than Francisco Joaquin Castelu Mesquiriz, who is the head of the Migration Task Force at the European Commission. Mr. Castelu Mesquiriz, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me too?
We can hear you well. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for granting the participation again at the end of this event of the European Commission. I know you want to give us some closing remarks, so I'll pass you the floor.
I will be very, very brief, but thank you very much, Mr. Simon, for for giving me the floor, and as well for all the participants who have gone through this 5 days, I think, of intensive work and cooperation, and with excellent results. And I have been following a little bit the exchanges and the work when I had the occasion. Very, very interesting. It was also good that we have this hybrid meeting that people can really interact as well physically. At least some of you as well is important. I hope next one will be totally personal. Thank you very much to ICMPD as well, of course, for the organization of the implementation of the project, organization as well of this conference. I think has given excellent results. I mean, basically the problem or the issue with the local and cities intervention and involvement in migration is that it is too little. I mean, not too little in terms of facts and in operation on the ground. So you are the ones who are actually, as usual, dealing with the migration problem more directly, much more directly than central governments, and certainly more directly than the Commission. But often you don't have this level of involvement is not reflected at the same with the same intensity and importance in the level of governance and the level as well of policy making. So that's why I think these kind of projects are very, very important. The cities are laboratories for inclusive societies and hubs for diversity and innovation. And that's why I think one reason or two more reasons, additional reasons for recognizing the importance of what you're doing. The Commission certainly supports more coherence, as Simon said, between the different levels, the local, national, and regional levels. The local governments are key, clearly, in the implementation of the new agenda of migration that the Commission has launched. And there is clearly a need for a stronger dialogue between the central and local levels to create this enabling environment, allowing for a more structured contribution and action of local authorities in migration governance. That's very clear as well. To realize our new agenda, the EU, as you know, is trying to mobilize huge amounts of funding with a leveraging 7 billion to go to create the leverage effect of investments at the amount of 30 billion euros. And this should, of course, be implemented with the full support and involvement of local authorities and cities in particular and municipalities. I was myself, in my younger times as well, a municipal councillor, so I understand a little bit of the challenges municipalities are confronted with and the daily travails as well in terms of really creating a coherent society, integrating migrants and, let's say, autochthonous population smoothly as well as seamlessly. I think this is our objective. The Commission is clearly behind this. Commissioner Johansson, Commissioner Hale as well are clearly behind this agenda. So this new agenda for the Mediterranean is, in our view, just the beginning of the process. The engagement with partners across the board, and in particular with you, will have and will deepen in coming months and years. And the Commission believes that local governments, as I said before, have to play and will play a key role in this process. So these kind of platforms like the city to city are becoming more and more important. And therefore, I'm grateful for this project that was supported by the Trust Fund, was supported by the Commission and implemented through ICMPD, and of course supported by the Migration Department of the ENIR. It will continue and has already borne a lot of fruits. Cities to City started in 2015. As I said, the Commission, by doing this project, recognized the role cities play in migration management. Cities worldwide are affected from migration, will remain a continuous cultural and social phenomenon. So the migration is not going to stop, as you know. It's an event, it's a development has happened for the last millennia, if not more, and clearly will continue. Is something we need to manage accordingly all together. And I am one of these optimistic that believes that the Pact, for example, will be, at least parts of the Pact will be adopted soon, that we will get in Europe a proper migration management, improved levels of migration management, and will also get as well true and stronger partnerships with our third countries over time, as we are kind of succeeding already step by step now, for having finally a more integrated society, as well as a better continuum between the autochthonous population and the migrants coming to Europe. So thank you very much for piloting relevant new solutions. And again, I wish you all the best for the continuation of the project and as well for our cooperation in the coming weeks, months, and years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gazelu Mesquiris, Head of Migration Task Force at the European Commission. On behalf of the MC2CM project, we are very happy and also proud to keep working with the European Commission. We have had Commissioner Varela on day one clearly stating the need for cities in the region to be involved in the migration governance process, and also even Deputy Director for DG Home, Mr. Luchner, intervened on this very topic, echoing the words of Commissioner Varela. And I'm also happy to hear that you have experience personal experience at the local council level. So definitely you can understand the challenges and the concerns, but also the opportunities that lie at this level of governance. And this is exactly what we try to do within this project. It's going on for a few years now. And to conclude this long event, I'm very happy to present to all of you, both here and online, the Deus Ex Machina behind the MC2CM project, the project manager, Lamine Abad. Lamine, it's been quite a week, And I suppose you want to say a few words before we conclude? What have been your thoughts about this event, and what do you think we can expect in the future?
Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you for your kind words. First of all, I would like to thank the European Union and the Swiss Cooperation Agency for Development, because they are those that are supporting us for many years in implementing this project. And I think it's important also to recognize, and as it has been said just before by Mr. Gazlo, the important contribution from the European Commission to the recognition of the role of cities in migration governance. I would like also to thank our partners, UCLG and UN Habitat. It's 6 years that we're having a very intensive partnership with them, and indeed they have been very supportive, very key in working toward this recognition of the role of local governments in migration governance, but also in supporting the technical assistance that we've been providing in the ground through city migration profiles, through peer learnings, through targeted city actions, ensuring that both we were enhancing the capacities of local authorities and local stakeholders to act as migration, to be migration actors and key migration actors, but also raising their voices in national, regional and international forums. I would like also to thank the whole team of ICMPD and the MC2CM team, those that are also behind the scene, because Marco has been our host the whole week, and thank you, Marco, for the great job that you have been doing. But also we had Pia, Manuela, Eva, Fatima, Monica, Amalia, Youssef behind the scenes. So I think we also need to acknowledge the great work that has been done by the team to make this happen. It's a hybrid event. It's the first time that we're organizing this type of event. It's an experience per se. So I really hope that you all enjoyed, and I can really tell you that the team has been doing a fantastic work to make this happen. Said that, as you said, Marco, we had a very intensive week. We have been hearing from many different perspectives from 9 countries around the Euro-Mediterranean. And indeed, along the MC2CM days, we had this opportunity to listen to local leaders and representatives from these 9 countries across the Euro-Mediterranean region, from Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Jordan, Spain, Italy, France, Sweden, Germany. And I think this is not the whole region. We have a very rich region in terms of countries. Nonetheless, I think it's already quite representative. And they have been sharing with us their practices, their contribution to migration governance, how they make migration happen. They showed us the way toward a renewed partnership. This renewed partnership should go promoting a right-based approach to migration, and that's what these representatives, thinking of the mayor of Lampedusa, of Tunis, representatives from Tripoli, representative from Irbid, from Sevilla, from Sala, I think we heard their voice. They want to shift the narrative, they want the narrative to go through a right-based approach to migration, and they want to be actors, key actors in this shift. Local authorities' role is recognized at all levels and by all actors. And this week we also heard from national authorities, we heard from European institutions, we heard from international organizations. We also had the chance to hear from civil society, private sector and academia. And they all agree on the key role the local level have to make migration work and beneficial for all. The new agenda for the Mediterranean and the new Pact on Migration are an opportunity. They are an opportunity to renew the partnership and to implement this vision that is migration makes cities grow and cities make migration work. We need to take this chance and foster a stronger and more structured dialogue between national and local authorities to ensure policy coherence and the full implication of local actors in migration governance. Capacities, resources and institutional frameworks need to be discussed and upgraded to allow this, this contribution, this full contribution from the local level. At our level, what can we look at in the future? Our will is to offer the needed political and technical platforms, the needed technical assistance to accompany this new approach, to ensure that local, national, regional and international agendas and priorities are aligned, are shared, and are implemented in the benefit of all groups and all sectors of our societies. So we really thank all the participants, the speakers, from all the levels for their engagement, and from our side we look forward to continue the work that has been done by City to City since 2015 and try to be even more present on the ground, more effective, and go toward action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lamine. And also would like to thank the interpreters. 5 days of conference certainly might take a toll, and a number of languages were used, from Italian to Spanish, English, French and Arabic. So thank you to the interpreters, thank you to the technicians at Blue Point that have facilitated this long week of events, and of course the social media team and the promotional team provided by Zedan Consulting. And thank you all for watching. I hope we'll be back next year with other events to raise the visibility of cities in urban migration governance. And stay tuned on the MC2CM social media. We have a lot of events coming up, a lot of activities, numerous, uncountable targeted city actions, publications to come. How to follow us? MC2CM on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn. Stay tuned. Thank you for being with us and hope to see you again.